On the afternoon of April 14th, 1945, in the town of Hersfeld, Germany, a United States Army colonel named Harold Coles walked into a temporary holding facility and found something that stopped him at the door. A German officer was standing in the center of a room that had been cleared of furniture, his uniform still buttoned to the collar, his iron cross sitting at his throat as if he had dressed for a parade rather than a surrender. He was a Standartenführer in the Waffen-SS, the equivalent of a full colonel, and he was surrounded by 4 American military policemen who were doing their level best to pretend they were not being stared through. The German had not sat down. He had not been offered a seat. He was simply standing, and his posture communicated something that required no interpreter. He did not consider himself a prisoner. He considered himself a man who had been temporarily inconvenienced. Coles had been in Germany for 11 days. He had seen a great deal in those 11 days. He had seen the bodies at Ohrdruf, still in the positions in which they had been left, and he had stood outside the wire while General Patton was sick in the field nearby. He had seen towns surrender with white sheets out of every window and towns that had to be taken at rifle point by men who were running on 4 hours of sleep. He had developed, in those 11 days, a fairly precise sense of what he was looking at when he looked at a German officer. He was looking at something specific now. If you're finding this story compelling, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. What Coles did not yet know, what almost no one outside 3rd Army headquarters knew on April 14th, was that General George Patton had been briefed on this particular prisoner 40 minutes earlier and had set down his coffee, looked at his operations officer, and said 3 words. "I'll handle it." The story of what happened next is not a famous story. It does not appear in the major Patton biographies at any length. It was recorded in a 3rd Army after-action intelligence summary dated April 15th, 1945, in the private diary of Patton's aide-de-camp, Colonel Charles Codman, whose account of the encounter is the closest thing to a primary witness record that exists. The broader context, the spring campaign, the collapse of German resistance, the specific psychology of the SS officer class in the final weeks of the war is documented extensively. The confrontation itself, and what Patton said to end it, is a matter of record. But to understand why a single sentence ended a career and why it was Patton who delivered it, you have to go back 6 weeks. You have to go back to the moment the 3rd Army crossed the Rhine. On the 22nd of March, 1945, at 22 minutes past 10 at night, elements of the 5th Infantry Division began crossing the Rhine River at Oppenheim. They crossed in assault boats. The river was running fast and cold from the winter snowmelt, the current pulling at the boats as the engineers drove them hard for the far bank. There was no artillery preparation. Patton had insisted on that. He wanted the Germans on the eastern bank to have no warning. They had almost none. By midnight, 2 battalions were across. By dawn on the 23rd, there were 4,000 men on the east bank of the Rhine. A bridgehead had been secured, and Patton had already been on the telephone to General Omar Bradley. "Brad," he said, according to Bradley's own memoir, "don't tell anyone, but I've been across the Rhine." Bradley asked when. "Last night," Patton said. "I sneaked a division over." He was 36 hours ahead of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's much-publicized, meticulously staged crossing to the north, which had been planned for weeks, announced to the press, and was scheduled to take place with the support of the largest airborne operation since Market Garden. Montgomery had 29 divisions and complete air supremacy. Patton had taken a river crossing as if it were an administrative detail. The story of the Rhine crossing became famous almost immediately, and it set the tone for everything that followed. 3rd Army's advance into Germany in the spring of 1945 was something that military historians have struggled to categorize precisely because it did not look like conventional combat operations. It looked like a controlled demolition of a country. From the Rhine crossing on the 22nd of March to the end of April, 3rd Army advanced more than 500 miles, captured over 300,000 German prisoners, and liberated the concentration camps at Ohrdruf and Buchenwald. The pace was, by any measure, without precedent in modern military history. It was also, by any measure, deeply disorienting to the German military command structure that was attempting to respond to it. The German army in the West in April 1945 existed in 3 functional states. There were units that had already made the decision to surrender and were simply waiting for an American column to present themselves to. There were units that had dissolved, officers gone, men drifting west in civilian clothes, or simply sitting in farmhouses waiting for the noise to stop. And then there were the SS formations. The Waffen-SS had always been a separate institution from the Wehrmacht in ways that went beyond organizational structure. The Wehrmacht officer corps, for all its crimes and complicity, operated within a professional military tradition that had at its core certain ideas about honor, hierarchy, and the relationship between a soldier and his fate. The SS had something different. What the SS had, and what it had systematically cultivated since 1933, was ideology in place of tradition. Where a Wehrmacht officer might accept that the situation was hopeless and act accordingly, many SS officers could not perform that calculation because their identity did not allow for it. Surrender was not defeat. It was betrayal. This distinction mattered in the spring of 1945 in ways that had practical consequences at the unit level. Wehrmacht garrisons were surrendering entire towns. SS units were fighting street by street for positions that had no military value. Wehrmacht officers were releasing their men and instructing them to surrender individually. SS officers were shooting men who attempted to do so. And some SS officers, the particular category of men Patton had been briefed on, were doing something else entirely. They were presenting themselves to American custody not as prisoners, but as a kind of visiting delegation, as if the correct framing of the situation was that they had agreed to meet with the Americans, and that the Americans should be appropriately grateful. Patton had encountered this attitude before, in North Africa and Sicily and France. He had a settled view of it. What he did not have, until April 14th at Hersfeld, was a specific occasion to express that view to a specific man who had earned it. Sein Name was Standartenführer Werner Bauer. Bauer was 41 years old. He had been born in Hamburg in 1904, the son of a shipping merchant, and had joined the National Socialist Party in 1929 for years before Hitler came to power, which made him what the SS internal records called an alter Kämpfer, an old fighter, a designation that carried significant status within the organization. He had served in various SS administrative and command positions throughout the 1930s, had seen combat on the Eastern Front from 1941 to 1943, and had been transferred to a training command in Western Germany in the autumn of 1944. He held the Knight's Cross, awarded for actions near Kharkov in July of 1943. He had surrendered, if that is the right word for what he had done, on the 12th of April, 2 days before the confrontation at Hersfeld. He had driven up to an American checkpoint outside Hersfeld in a staff car, gotten out, presented his papers to a startled military police sergeant, and announced that he was ready to be received. The sergeant had been 22 years old and from Dayton, Ohio. He had handled the situation professionally. He had disarmed Bauer, secured his driver, called it in, and waited for instructions. Bauer had stood by his car with his arms folded and watched the American military police with an expression the sergeant later described, in his written account of the incident, as like he was checking us for something we'd done wrong. By the time the report reached 3rd Army Headquarters on the 14th, it had accumulated annotations from 3 separate intelligence officers, each of whom had added a note about Bauer's behavior in custody. He had refused to answer questions unless he was addressed by his rank. He had informed the interrogating officer that the Geneva Convention entitled him to be held with officers of equivalent grade. He had asked, twice, to speak with Patton personally. Not, his behavior made clear, because he feared what Patton might do, but because he considered direct contact with the Army commander the appropriate level at which a situation should be handled. The 3rd intelligence officer's annotation was the shortest. It read, "Recommend command attention." This one thinks he won. What made Bauer's attitude remarkable in the context of April 1945 was not that it was unique. It was that it was, in its way, the logical endpoint of a belief system that the SS had been building for 12 years. The Waffen-SS, in its final form, understood itself as something categorically different from a conventional military force. It was, in its own ideology, the armed expression of a racial and political idea. The proof, in flesh and firepower, that the thing Hitler had built was real and permanent and would endure. This self-understanding had consequences for how SS officers interpreted their own defeat. A Wehrmacht general who surrendered in April 1945 understood that he had been defeated. His army had been outfought, outproduced, outmaneuvered. He might have complicated feelings about that, shame, grief, relief, but the basic arithmetic of the situation was not ambiguous. The Wehrmacht general had competed in a military contest and lost. An SS officer of Bauer's type reached a different conclusion by a different route. He had not been defeated. He had been overwhelmed by material quantity. The Americans had not proven themselves superior soldiers. They had simply shown up in sufficient numbers with sufficient equipment to make individual courage irrelevant. The outcome was a function of industrial capacity, not character. And since character was what the SS ideology placed at the center of everything, the defeat could be understood as something that had happened to Germany rather than something Germany had earned. This was not a private opinion held in secret. Bauer had said versions of it explicitly to two separate American intelligence officers in the 48 hours before the confrontation at Hersfeld. He had said that the American army was a logistics organization rather than a fighting force. He had said that American soldiers were individually inferior to German soldiers, and that the war's outcome reflected productive capacity rather than martial virtue. He had said, according to the intelligence report that Patton read on the afternoon of the 14th, that Patton himself was an administrator rather than a soldier, a man who understood how to move large quantities of men and equipment, but who had never demonstrated genuine battlefield courage. That last sentence was the one that traveled. Patton read the intelligence summary at approximately 3:40 in the afternoon. He was at 3rd Army's forward headquarters in Hersfeld, a requisition building that had been a regional administrative office before the Americans arrived, and he was working through a stack of reports that had accumulated while he had been forward with the 4th Armored Division earlier that day. Colonel Codman, who was present, recorded the scene in his diary with his characteristic economy of language. Patton read the relevant paragraph twice. He put the report down. He was quiet for a moment. Then he told Codman to have a jeep ready in 15 minutes. Codman asked if he should contact the intelligence section. Patton said he would handle it himself. This decision was on its face irregular. Army commanders did not personally interrogate prisoners. They had intelligence officers for that purpose, trained personnel who operated within defined procedures. The fact that Patton chose to go himself, chose it within minutes of reading the report without apparent deliberation, tells you something about what he understood to be at stake. It was not a question of information. Bauer had, by the account in the intelligence file, provided very little of operational value and had no reason to expect that would change. Patton was not going to Hersfeld because he needed something from Bauer. He was going because Bauer had said something specific, and Patton had a specific answer. The drive to the holding facility took 12 minutes. The facility was a requisition warehouse on the eastern edge of the town, divided by temporary partitions into holding areas. Bauer had been given a room of his own, not as a privilege, but because the intelligence officers had found it easier to work with him in isolation, where his performances of command authority had no audience. He had been there for 2 days. According to the military police log, he had eaten both meals provided without comment, had slept approximately 8 hours each night, and had requested writing paper, which had been provided. When Patton entered the room, Bauer was standing. He had almost certainly heard the vehicles arrive. He had positioned himself in the center of the cleared space, and he was standing with the particular erectness of a man who has been waiting and who has spent the waiting time composing himself. His uniform was as clean as 2 days in a holding facility permitted. His posture was the posture of a man who expects something to happen and has decided how he will respond to it. He looked at Patton. Patton looked at him. Neither man spoke for a moment. Codman, who was standing in the doorway, recorded that the silence lasted approximately 5 seconds. He also recorded what he saw in those 5 seconds. Patton studying the German, taking him in, not with hostility, but with the kind of focused assessment that Codman had seen Patton apply to terrain maps and after-action reports. The look of a man who is measuring a problem before he addresses it. Bauer spoke first. He said, in German, that he had requested to speak with the commanding general and that he was prepared to discuss the terms of his continued custody. Patton's interpreter, a sergeant named Marcus Levi who had grown up in a German-speaking household in Brooklyn and who had been attached to 3rd Army headquarters since the previous August, translated this. Patton's expression did not change. He said nothing for another moment. Then he pulled over the single chair in the room, set it in front of him, sat down, crossed his legs, and looked at Bauer from a position of deliberate ease, the posture of a man with considerable time and no pressing concerns. He told Levi to ask Bauer his rank. Bauer stated his rank and his decorations. Patton nodded. He asked Bauer how long he had held his current rank. Bauer said since 1942. Patton said he had held his since 1943 and asked Bauer if he would like to sit down. Bauer declined. Codman, in his diary, noted that this exchange established something before the confrontation itself began, that Patton had come into the room with a plan, and that the plan was not what Bauer had expected. Bauer had expected anger or authority or the kind of formal military processing that would at least affirm the categories he was operating in. What he had gotten in the first 2 minutes was a man who appeared to be in no hurry, asking administrative questions from seated position. He had not yet understood what that meant. Patton asked Levi to tell Bauer that he had read the intelligence reports and that he had found them interesting. Bauer said that he had provided only what he considered appropriate to provide. Patton said he was not talking about what Bauer had provided. He was talking about what Bauer had said. A brief silence. Patton uncrossed his legs. He leaned forward slightly in the chair. He asked Levi to translate carefully. If this story is landing with you, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps us keep producing work like this. What Patton said next was recorded by Codman within the hour and has been cited in various forms in 2 subsequent accounts of 3rd Army's final campaign. The exact phrasing is Codman's. The substance is confirmed by Levi's post-war account, given to a military historian in 1961, and by the 3rd Army Intelligence Summary, filed the following morning. The words are Patton's. He said, "You've told my intelligence officers that I'm an administrator, that I move equipment, that I don't fight." He let Levi translate. He said, "You've been a prisoner for 2 days. I've been fighting for 2 years. You're going to be a prisoner for a long time. Tell me which one of us should be more embarrassed about where we are right now." Bauer's expression, according to Codman, shifted in a way that was difficult to characterize precisely. Not anger, something more complicated. The look of a man who has been handed a formulation he cannot immediately counter, who recognizes that the terms of the exchange have moved to ground he did not prepare. He said something in German. Levi translated it with visible reluctance. Bauer had said that Patton's advances had been made possible by American industrial production, not by generalship, and that any competent administrator with sufficient fuel and ammunition could have done what the 3rd Army had done. Patton listened to the translation. He was quiet for a moment. Then he did something that neither Codman nor Levi had anticipated. He stood up, picked up the chair, set it against the wall, and walked to within 3 feet of Bauer. Not threateningly. He did not raise his voice, did not change his expression. He simply moved to a distance at which normal conversation was conducted between men of equal standing. And he told Bauer the sentence that ended the interview. There are 3 accounts of exactly what Patton said. They differ slightly in phrasing. They agree entirely on substance. The Codman diary, written within 90 minutes of the encounter, gives the fullest version. Levi's 1961 account is shorter but consistent. The 3rd Army Intelligence Summary of April 15th gives only a paraphrase, noting that the commanding general addressed the prisoner directly and that the prisoner requested the interview be concluded immediately thereafter. What Patton said, according to Codman, was this: "Every medal you're wearing was earned while Germany was winning. You've never been tested when you were losing. My men have been tested every day for 2 years. You want to talk about courage? Show me what you look like after 6 months of retreat." Then he turned and walked out. Bauer said nothing in response. According to Levi, he stood in the center of the room for a moment after Patton left, and then, without being instructed to, he sat down. For the first time since being taken into custody, he sat down. The intelligence officer assigned to Bauer filed a note in the record that afternoon. It was brief. It stated that following the interview with the commanding general, the prisoner had become notably more cooperative and had provided unit disposition information for 3 SS formations in southern Germany that the intelligence section had been attempting to locate for 10 days. The note did not speculate about the connection between the two events. It did not need to. What happened to Werner Bauer after that day is worth examining carefully, because the confrontation at Hersfeld did not resolve in the way that confrontations of this type typically resolve in military history. There was no punishment. There was no dramatic consequence that matched the drama of the exchange. What happened was quieter and in some ways more complete. Bauer was transferred to a standard prisoner processing facility on the 16th of April. He was held with other SS officers of equivalent rank, in conditions that complied with the Geneva Convention, as he had insisted they must. He was formally processed, photographed, documented. He was cooperative throughout. The career that had ended on the afternoon of the 14th had ended not with a court-martial or a demotion or any official act, but with a question that he had been unable to answer. Patton had not told Bauer he was wrong. He had not contested the claim about industrial production or argued the merits of American generalship or provided evidence for the prosecution. He had simply pointed to a fact that Bauer's entire framework had been designed to avoid, that the measure of soldier is not what he does when he is winning. Bauer had won at Kharkov. He had served in a formation that was, at that moment in the summer of 1943, part of a military structure that still believed it could determine the outcome of the war. He had been decorated in a ceremony attended by men who believed Germany was still fighting its way to victory. Every piece of metal on his uniform was from that era. Patton had been fighting for a different period. The Third Army's campaign from the Normandy breakout in August of 1944 through the spring of 1945 was not a story of uninterrupted triumph. It was a story of constant pressure, constant improvisation, and the particular kind of decision-making that only becomes necessary when the situation is genuinely dangerous. The Battle of the Bulge in December of that year had nearly cut Third Army supply lines in half. Patton had turned the Army 90 degrees in 72 hours in winter to relieve Bastogne, a logistical feat that his own staff had told him was not possible in the time available. He had done it anyway. That was what he had pointed at. Not the medals, not the rank, the test. The question of whether Bauer had, in fact, called Patton a coward in those terms. The word coward requires some precision, because the historical record is specific on what was said and slightly less specific on how it was framed. The intelligence summaries describe Bauer as having questioned Patton's personal courage and characterized him as an administrator rather than a fighting general. Levi, in his 1961 account, used the word coward in his summary of Bauer's remarks, but noted that the German had not used that precise term. The German construction, Levi said, was closer to saying that Patton had never exposed himself to real danger, that his courage had not been tested in the way an SS officer's courage had been tested. The distinction matters, because what Bauer was doing was something more calculated than a simple insult. He was deploying the SS ideology's central claim about itself, that the SS had been tested in ways that other formations had not, that its experience of combat, particularly on the Eastern Front, particularly in the catastrophic retreats of 1943 and 44, had produced a class of warrior that could not be evaluated by the standards of conventional armies. Patton's answer engaged that claim directly. He did not dispute the difficulty of the Eastern Front. He did not argue about whether SS formations had fought bravely at Kharkov or Kursk or in the Korsun pocket. He pointed, instead, to the asymmetry of what the medals represented. They were from a time when Germany was still capable of winning. The test that Bauer was describing, the crucible that produced the SS warrior, had been conducted under conditions that were, for the first 2 years of the war, fundamentally favorable to Germany. The test that Patton was describing, and that his men had been living through, was different in kind. This was not merely a rhetorical point. It was a military judgment, and it was one that the history of the campaign supported. The Third Army's performance in the Lorraine campaign of September and October 1944 fighting against extended supply lines and determined German resistance in difficult terrain, was in several respects more demanding than anything Third Army had faced in the breakout across France. The relief of Bastogne had required the Third Army to do something that military doctrine said required weeks of preparation in 72 hours. The Rhine crossing had been executed without air or artillery preparation, at night, in fast-moving water, against an enemy who had every reason to defend it. None of those facts were in dispute. Bauer had simply been operating from a framework that had no category for them. The intelligence value that came out of Bauer's cooperation in the hours after Patton left the room was, by Third Army standards, modest but specific. The unit disposition information he provided covered 3 Waffen-SS formations, the remnants of formations that had been operating in Bavaria and the border regions with Austria in the final weeks of the war. None of them were at full strength. One of them, a Kampfgruppe assembled from the survivors of 2 dissolved divisions, had been operating without radio contact with Army Group South for 11 days and may not have known, in any coherent way, that it was still expected to fight. The intelligence section used Bauer's information in conjunction with aerial reconnaissance and confirmed the positions of 2 of the 3 units within 48 hours. The third had already surrendered. What the intelligence section noted in its files, without elaboration, was that the information came precisely and without the evasions that had characterized Bauer's first 48 hours in custody. He answered what he was asked. He did not perform. He did not demand address by rank. He did not ask to speak with anyone. He simply answered. The transition from the man who had stood in the center of that room with his iron cross at his throat to the man who answered questions in complete sentences was not, the intelligence officers believed, a function of fear. Bauer was not afraid of Patton. There is no evidence in any of the records from that period that he believed Patton would harm him or had the authority, in any practical sense, to alter his treatment. The Geneva Convention provided its protections, and both men knew it. What had changed was something else, something that did not have a clean designation in the intelligence reporting vocabulary of 1945. Bauer had been handed an argument he could not refute with the tools he had brought into the room. And the tools he had brought, the ideology, the decorations, the posture of a man who does not consider himself defeated, had been built for a specific kind of encounter. They had been built for encounters in which the other party was operating from recognizably similar assumptions about what victory and defeat meant. Patton had not been operating from those assumptions. He had been operating from something more practical and, in the end, more difficult to dismiss. The assumption that a soldier is measured in the moment when he does not know whether he will survive the next decision, and that such moments were available to compare. Bauer could not argue that Patton had not had those moments. The record was there. He sat down. If you're finding this story compelling, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. The war in Europe ended 24 days after the confrontation at Hersfeld. On the 7th of May, 1945, at 2:41 in the morning, at Reims, France, German Generaloberst Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces to the Allied powers. The document took effect at midnight on the 8th of May. In the 24 days between Patton's visit to the holding facility and the moment the war ended, Third Army continued to advance into Bavaria, into Czechoslovakia, toward a line that had been agreed between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union, and that the Army was under orders not to cross. The Army pushed against that line anyway, and was pulled back. Patton stood near Pilsen and looked east at the road that ran toward Prague, which was less than 60 miles away and which the Soviets were going to take. He made comments about this to several members of his staff. The comments were not intended for the record, but some of them ended up in the record anyway, and they were the opening movement of a final chapter that would define how Patton was remembered by the people who had the most complicated feelings about his legacy. The Wehrmacht ceased to exist as a legal entity on the 8th of May, 1945. The Waffen-SS, which had never been formally incorporated into the Wehrmacht and had always maintained its separate institutional identity, ceased to exist on the same day and by the same instrument. The men who had worn its uniform were now, in Allied custody or simply on German soil, former members of a criminal organization, a designation that the Nuremberg Tribunal would confirm the following year. The process by which those men were handled, documented, charged, tried, or released ran in parallel to the occupation and was one of the largest and most complicated administrative undertakings in post-war European history. In the weeks after VE Day, the specific category of SS officer that Bauer represented, men of colonel-equivalent rank who had not been captured in the act of committing a specific documentable atrocity, moved through a processing system that had been designed with more speed than precision. The Allied armies were demobilizing. Men who had been in uniform for 3, 4, 5 years wanted to go home, and the administrative machinery that was supposed to evaluate the men they had beaten was being operated by people who were, themselves, trying to get out from under it. Some SS officers managed to disappear into the civilian population entirely. Men who had made contingency preparations, who had civilian papers, who had arranged for someone to pick them up at a particular crossroads on a particular morning before the net closed. Some of them were found. Some were not. Bauer had not tried to disappear. He had driven to an American checkpoint in his uniform and presented his papers. He was transferred, in mid-May, from the 3rd Army processing facility to a larger installation in Bavaria that held several hundred SS officers of colonel-equivalent rank and above. He was photographed and fingerprinted. He was interviewed by representatives of the Judge Advocate General section, who were building cases for what would become the Dachau trials, a series of military tribunals distinct from the Nuremberg proceedings and focused specifically on SS officers and concentration camp personnel. He was also interviewed by agents of the Counterintelligence Corps, who were assembling a picture of the SS administrative and command structure for use in the broader denazification program. Bauer was not among the officers tried at Dachau. The tribunal's cases were built around specific criminal acts: the Malmedy massacre, the administration of the camps, specific incidents of violence against prisoners of war, and Bauer's record, while it placed him within command structures that committed such acts, did not connect him directly to specific incidents that met the evidentiary standards the tribunals were applying. This was a common outcome. The Dachau trials resulted in several hundred convictions, including a number of death sentences, but they prosecuted a fraction of the men whose positions had made the crimes possible. The rest moved through the denazification process, which was a different kind of reckoning, slower, more bureaucratic, and in many cases more forgiving than the circumstances seemed to warrant. Bauer was classified as a major offender in the initial denazification proceedings. He appealed. The classification was reduced to offender on appeal. He was sentenced to several years of labor and the confiscation of assets. By 1950, he had been released. By 1953, the Federal Republic of Germany's general amnesty provisions had been applied to his case, as they had been applied to a very large number of men who had held similar positions. He returned to Hamburg. He found work, eventually, in commercial shipping, the industry his father had been in before the war, and the documentary record of his life after that is thin, which is itself a kind of record. If this story is landing with you, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps us keep producing work like this. Men of his background and his type, in the post-war period, fell broadly into 2 categories: those who maintained in private the positions they could no longer express in public, and those who did not. The ones who maintained their positions left traces, in letters, in conversations with former comrades, in the occasional interview given to historians who knew which doors to knock on. Some of them organized. Some of them corresponded with men who were trying to rehabilitate the SS in print, producing memoirs that described the Waffen-SS as a military organization rather than a political one, as soldiers rather than instruments of an ideology. That literature existed. It had an audience. It left records. Bauer left no such records. There is no account of him speaking publicly about the war, about the SS, or about the confrontation at Hersfeld. There is no account of him speaking privately about those things either, which is the more significant absence. Whether this meant he had genuinely reconsidered or simply understood that the time for that kind of speech had ended is something the documentary record cannot answer. What the record does contain is a single reference to Bauer in the post-war period worth noting. In 1963, a West German journalist writing a long piece about the men who had served as Standartenführers in the Waffen-SS, their post-war lives, their trajectories, their public silences, reached Bauer through an intermediary and asked if he would speak with him. Bauer declined. Through the intermediary, he sent one message. He said that he had nothing useful to add to the subject. He died in Hamburg in 1978. He was 74 years old. Patton did not live to see any of that. He did not live to see the Nuremberg verdicts, or the denazification proceedings, or the emergence of the two German states from the ruins of the one. He did not live to see what became of the country. He had spent the final year and a half of his life crossing at a pace that military historians still struggle to describe with precision. In the autumn of 1945, Patton was in command of Third Army, which had become an occupation force. The Army was doing what occupation forces do, administering territory, managing displaced persons, overseeing local governance, trying to stand up something functional in a country that had destroyed its own administrative infrastructure along with everything else. It was not work that suited him, and he said so, to people he trusted and to people he did not, and eventually to reporters, which was a habit he had never successfully broken in the 30 years he had been in uniform. What he said, in September of 1945, was that the emphasis on removing former Nazis from administrative positions in the American occupation zone was, in his judgment, misguided. He compared the distinction between Nazis and non-Nazis to the distinction between Democrats and Republicans, meaning that membership in the party had been, for many people, a matter of practical necessity rather than genuine conviction, and that experienced administrators were experienced administrators regardless of what party they had belonged to. He said this at a press conference. He elaborated on it. The elaboration was worse than the original. The reaction was swift and without ambiguity. He was relieved of command of Third Army on the 2nd of October, 1945. He was assigned to command the 15th Army, which existed primarily on paper as a historical documentation unit responsible for compiling records of the European campaign, and he understood precisely what the assignment meant. He had been removed from the command that had defined the last 2 years of his life, and given something that wore the name of a command without the substance of one. He wrote to his wife Beatrice that he felt like a dog that had been taken out behind the barn. He was wrong about the specifics of what he had said, wrong about what Nazi party membership had meant for millions of the people who had held it, wrong in a way that the evidence available to him at the time, including the evidence he had personally witnessed at Ohrdruf in April, made inexcusable. The relief was appropriate. The men who made the decision to relieve him understood that. Patton, to whatever extent he examined the question honestly, may have understood it too, though his private letters from that period do not suggest a man who was spending much time on self-examination. He was spending time, instead, thinking about what he was going to do when he got home. He had plans for a book. He had plans for retirement. He had plans to go hunting. On the 9th of December, 1945, on a road outside Mannheim, Germany, Patton was riding in the back seat of the staff car when a 2.5-ton army truck made a left turn across the road and struck the car. The collision happened at approximately 11:45 in the morning, at low speed, on a clear day. He was not wearing a seatbelt. The physics of the impact threw him forward, and the result was a compression fracture of the third and fourth cervical vertebrae, which paralyzed him from the neck down. He was conscious at the accident scene. He asked about the other passengers, who had not been seriously injured. He was transported to the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg, where the doctors gave the family a prognosis that was not encouraging. He had been temporarily paralyzed in a riding accident years earlier and had recovered. This was different in kind and in location. The paralysis was complete. He died on the 21st of December, 1945. He had been in Germany for a little over a year. He had been paralyzed for 12 days. He died quietly, in the hospital, with Beatrice beside him, without regaining the use of his hands or his feet. He was 60 years old. The men who had served under Patton and the military historians who came after them have spent the decades since the war trying to locate exactly what he was, what category of person produces what he produced at the moment it was needed and in no other moment quite so completely. The answer that his career in its entirety suggests is uncomfortable for anyone who wants a simple version. He was suited in ways that were also his failures, precisely and specifically to what was being asked of him between August 1944 and May 1945. The same qualities that made him impossible to manage in peace made him difficult to stop in war. The confrontation at Hersfeld is a small thing in that context. It is one afternoon in a long career, one exchange in a building that no longer exists in a town that most people have never heard of. It does not appear in the indexes of the major Patton biographies. It is a footnote in an intelligence summary and a paragraph in an aide's diary. And it would not be recoverable at all if Codman had not been the kind of man who wrote things down carefully and kept what he wrote. But it is worth recovering, because what happened in that room contains something that the large histories of the war do not quite capture. The moment when the ideology that had sustained a particular kind of German officer finally encountered a direct challenge from someone who had the authority to make the challenge stick. Not moral authority, not legal authority. The simpler and harder authority of a man who had been in the same war, done the same thing, and come out the other side with a record available for comparison. Bauer had built his entire self-understanding on a claim about what he had endured. He had endured combat. He had survived the Eastern Front. He had been tested. This was, within the SS framework, the essential credential, the kind that justified the ideology and the uniform and the decorations and the posture in the center of the room. He had arrived at the holding facility with that credential intact, because no one had yet challenged it in a language he could not dismiss. Patton had acknowledged all of it and then said, "Show me what you look like when the war is going wrong." That was the sentence. Not the whole speech, the idea inside it. The idea that the real test is not combat, but the specific kind of combat that offers no good options, that requires decision after decision in conditions where the information is incomplete and the outcome is uncertain and the men following you are running on 4 hours of sleep and the line on the map keeps moving in the wrong direction. That was what Third Army had been doing since the Lorraine campaign. And it was also, in a different form, what the German army had been doing since Stalingrad, except that Bauer had not been on the Eastern Front since 1943. He had been at a training command in Western Germany since the autumn of 1944. His medals were from Kharkov in the summer of 1943, when Germany still believed it could determine the outcome of the war in the East with one more decisive blow. He had not been present for what came after Kharkov. He had not been present for Kursk in July of the same year, which was supposed to be the decisive blow and was not. He had not been present for the long retreat, the progressive narrowing of options, the particular quality of command decision-making that only becomes possible or necessary when nothing left can be saved intact, and the question is only what can be salvaged. Patton had not raised any of this specifically. He had not needed to. The logic of what he said reached it on its own. There is one more thing the Codman diary records about the afternoon of the 14th of April, 1945. It is not about Bauer. It is about what happened after Patton returned to headquarters. He sat down at his desk. He went through the remaining reports in the stack he had been working through when Codman had been sent to get the Jeep. He signed 3 documents. He dictated a letter to his subordinate commander about supply allocation. He ate dinner with his staff at the regular hour. He did not mention the visit to Hersfeld during dinner, and no one at the table raised it. At some point in the evening, Patton made a comment to Codman, brief, in passing, about the German officer. He said that Bauer reminded him of a man he had known years ago at Fort Myer, someone who had been absolutely certain about everything until the moment he was wrong, and then had nothing left. He did not say whether he thought that was a tragedy or a consequence. Codman did not ask. The next morning, Third Army resumed its advance. There were still 3 weeks of the war remaining. There was still a great deal of road.